All right. And today we're excited to have Kim Eckert, the Dean of Oxford Teachers College at Reach University, sharing some of her best practices and perspective with us around serving working learners. So welcome, Kim. The first thing that I'd like to ask is when you are thinking about supporting working learners, how is the learning experience for a teacher apprentice different from a full-time educator who is pursuing a degree online in a non-apprenticeship educator preparation program?
Okay, love that question. And because it's Zoom, I have to make sure. Can you hear me okay? All right. This is just the way that it is. So it's interesting. And I'm going to backtrack just a little bit because I think we went into this work thinking that things were the same in ways that were really kind of silly for us to think they were the same. Because apprenticeship, it means that the person's obviously working in the school, they're in the building every day, but they're not teachers, right? But they're also not more traditional college students who really only have access to a building if there's written permission and a background check. So it was honestly in the meeting of both of those that we understood why the experience needed to be different. So the number one thing that makes it different is that they actually are impacting lives every day. And we know that in critical shortage, a lot of our school-based support, they are sometimes the lead, they're the person of record, even though they're not getting paid. It's just that's what teacher shortage is. So I'm here in Louisiana, and it hasn't been uncommon even before COVID for a paraprofessional to be the geometry teacher because there's just no one else. And so whenever you meet that reality with it, and you understand that every day is an opportunity to make practice better, it's exciting. It's so authentic and so real. And it helps you approach the learning in a way that's so much more sophisticated and so much more urgent. So I would say that the experience altogether is very different for the apprenticeship because it's all completely applicable to their job. And we know that with adult learners, that is something that's super critical. Like even this meeting, the minute you decide that it's not relevant to you, you're going to just press stop, right? It's something that adults have the wherewithal to do. And so whenever you have a program that has the opportunity to really engage their learning and help them understand, hey, you're on this job. We're not promising you're going to be a great teacher in 4 years when you have your own classroom. You're going to be a better teacher tomorrow. It's just such a bigger incentive. And so I think that makes the learning so much more real, so much more powerful, and really gets to the urgency and starts the work of becoming a great teacher much sooner.
That's great. Will you share with us how Reach has structured your coursework for working learners? How much is asynchronous versus synchronous time?
Yes. And we learned so much along the way. And the first thing that's important to note is that we are full-time only. So we don't actually have a part-time program. And if anybody's like, what? You should be, because to be a full-time student at any point in my life, in terms of undergrad and having a full-time job, it's not for the faint of heart. And I don't know that I could have come on the other end like our candidates do. Um, so the way that things are structured, we have found that with this particular learner, they actually need the synchronous piece. So with every course, they're meeting for at least an hour live. We do have some classes, especially later on, whenever they get towards the clinical year, where they may be a couple of hours long. But that's really important because we actually treat a lot of the learning in terms of the same ways that we would if it was a PLC, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But we need that constant. It's not just about accountability. It's because we need the constant ability to take what they're learning, so the theory, right, and the modeling and all of that, and put it into practice. But then that's just one piece. We can't leave it laying out there on the field, the opportunity to take it back to the class. So at any point, we're able to sort of teach strategies or teach history, teach about anything, but everything we learn should honestly make something different about what we're doing. Like, how are you different? How do you think differently? What will you do differently? How will you be different? Like, and so to be able to have that conversation and that check, largely what we use an inquiry-based style of teaching is just really critical because it helps them put it together and we see just results much faster, because it's different to just do an assignment and you leave it there. It's much different whenever you have to talk about it the next week and the actual impact that it had on the environment that you're in, the students, with your colleagues. So we do need that like that synchronous piece, but then obviously the asynchronous pieces are all the things that they're doing on their own. So it doesn't look that different from traditional programs in that sense. Um, and then there's other pieces, the way that it's structured, it's all really relevant. Like I said, we don't make them wait years and years before they enter into their first education class. So that happens immediately. Because again, we have them with students immediately, right? And so really from the start, they're taking every semester classes that are designed to make their job performance better. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to just graduate people who can teach, right? We want to graduate people who can be great teachers. And we don't want to waste any minutes with that. And since they're already in the classroom, there's no reason not to involve their classroom into our work from the start.
That's great. Can you speak more to those instructional strategies that are
Mm.
effective for teacher apprentices, really taking that theory to practice?
Yes, and for this, it's exciting. All the pieces of our lives that make us who we are. So I was a teacher and I still teach actually, 16 years in the classroom and then 13 years of that instructional coaching or like, an administrator with academics in some form or fashion. That is actually what I brought to inform a lot of the work because I realized from the start that it really didn't fit anywhere else. So I was going to have to treat it more like I would treat the supportive teachers on a campus than I would teacher hopefuls because that it just doesn't work whenever you have people that are just ready, they're right there, they need the learning right now. And so a lot of the teaching practices, and I know we talk about them because I was also an adjunct in an undergrad school of ed for many years before I started my work with Reach. But it's different to talk about things like coaching and collaboration and modeling and being culture responsive. It's a different ball game when you can actually implement those things immediately and they start to matter so much more immediately. So some of the things I just mentioned, like coaching, that doesn't just happen in their final year. Every assignment is an opportunity to be coached. And so we also do something akin to mastery-based grading. So if assignments aren't at proficient levels, why would we let that go on for years or for a whole semester? We have an opportunity to really fix it in the moment. And so whenever students aren't really um, at the proficiency level or mastering things, we ask them to do it again as many times as it takes. And the impetus there, it's not about an A, it's not about getting a grade. It's if you're learning strategies to support students with autism, that student still has autism tomorrow. So what are you going to do differently? Like an F just isn't good enough, or a C sometimes isn't good enough. And so that really um, compels learners in our program to take a lot more agency over the learning and to really separate the fact that it's not performative. We need to be impactful, and you need to be impactful now. And that's not something that you wait 4 years to become. And through that, we're also learning that we're getting incredibly coachable candidates. And the funny thing is, we are not direct recruiters. The ways that we get numbers come directly through word of mouth in school districts. And I think it's that difference that principals are seeing on buildings, like, wow, something's going on with this para, with this school secretary, like they're amazing. And it really comes down to the fact that they're being coached immediately. So I'd say that's a huge piece that starts very soon. Reflective practice is going to be important no matter what, especially whenever it's tied to, again, actionable real-time student data, student learning. And then, just all the other pieces that come together. We have a really amazing faculty that they're really great. They're really gifted teachers outside of the college space. And so every opportunity for modeling, we're not just modeling actual, like, maybe pedagogical things with teaching. We're modeling belonging and we're modeling environment and we're modeling being responsive to people that are before you and what a difference that makes and having high expectations, but the high expectations for ourselves to help learners meet that. So I think it's all those pieces that can't necessarily be learned in a book, but should be taught nonetheless. But most teachers graduate, and unless they have a really great instructional coach or a really great admin, they don't really learn those other pieces. And it's something that we really fold in from the beginning because we can. Because why not?
That's great. Can you speak, and I think this speaks to ensuring rigor. Can you speak
Yeah.
specifically to how you ensure rigor and college level work in an
Yeah.
apprenticeship?
Yes, and that's a question that we get a lot. And then you also start to understand that in those conversations, a lot of times there's a lot of disagreement in what rigor means. So that's a fun activity to even have with the faculty of anybody who's watching right now. And this is something that we actually pulled back and we looked back into the research of pre-K-12 where it comes to rigor and relevance. That was something that was huge because we knew that we were using a model that we didn't have a whole lot for in terms of schools of education. We know that learning and apprenticeship models is incredibly rigorous because there are other parts of the world that nearly every degree is apprenticeable, from the medical field to business, right? But in our case, we really needed to try what do we know and what do we know works well. So whenever you think something that we traditionally rely upon in ed prep, but also in pre-K-12 would be like Bloom's taxonomy, right? Where the upper levels of that, it's like, evaluating and creating. And that's one thing, right? And we know that there's so many ways to do that because you can be evaluating and creating like miles below where you're capable, and that can happen at any point. And then the trick for that is the relevance with it. So whenever you look at any rigor relevance model or like even like Webb's depth of knowledge or anything like that, it really comes down to can you reach those high levels in terms of like learning taxonomy, but can you actually apply them in predictable situations? And then the biggest one is unpredictable situations. And we know that with teaching, there are no job aids. Like everything goes out the window when the bell rings, and then it goes out the window again when it rings for second hour. So we do that kind of going in rigor for us. The easy benchmark was actually meeting accreditation rigor. We're holding ourselves to a higher standard than that, and that's actually effective classroom teaching because you were not going through a rigorous program if we are losing people in numbers we've been in the first 3 years. That tells us that whatever we've done and whatever we've labeled it as, it's not transferring over. And so that's something that we all needed to take a deep look at because if it was working, there wouldn't be a need for a reach, right? If we weren't bleeding teachers who just didn't feel like they were equipped to be able to handle today's classroom. And so again, that's an enormous responsibility that I took on as a leader and that our institution had to take on, but really pointing all the fingers back at ourselves. And so whenever it comes to rigor, it's not just does it pass muster for accreditation, it's also are we going to graduate people who are going to feel equipped to actually stay the long game in this really, really tremendously difficult profession that's always changing. And so that may have been a longer answer than it was wanted, but I think it deserves sort of the weight and the intentionality that we went with and the ways that we had to internally start to describe rigor. And so through that, just a variation of different assignments. We do have assignments that are more traditional, like where, there's written reflections and things like that, or they do need to compare policies. Actually, we use a lot of real-time, real data. So that means that where an assignment would have been like, read this report that was written in 1979 about the prevalence of disabilities. And I say that because that's my jam. I'm always going to like center myself there. And then, write some reflections on it. But the difference is you're also looking at that report from the 1970s, but then you're also looking at, the updates in IDEA and then your own district looking at the same data from yesterday. Now tell us what you see and make meaning out of that. And so that's what we mean, because I make jokes even in my high school classroom, like this Eckert's not always going to be here. So we teach them that way. We want to work ourselves out of a job in that sense, where they have what they need to be able to answer the big questions. And to be able to perform in ways that teachers need to perform. And that's not, some of it is through multiple choice testings. We still have standardized testing that every teacher has to undergo. But it's a lot more than that. And everything is real time and real creation. So it just kind of shows you like some of the gambit of what's being asked. Another example that's sort of lighter, like, creating newsletters or things like that. Well, we want you to create a newsletter and we need you to translate it into the second dominant language of your campus. How do you do that? Well, let's find some translating stuff. Well, let's call parents. Let's actually get out to the community. So it actually gives us an opportunity to fold so many more rich layers into the content because it's not just content. There's real families, there's real kids, there's real teachers, there's real needs. And it actually makes the learning a lot more fun, which helps the candidates not even realize how much we're really kicking their butts in those assignments.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. We've talked about what those assignments can look like. Can you speak to what assessments look like at Reach for those apprentice teacher candidates?
Yes. So I alluded to some of those just now. So obviously first, and it's all of our all of our plights, right? No matter which state you're in, but the standardized testing, which is, our practice, our licensure exams, whatever those may be, or Pearson's Foundation of Reading. We're in multiple states, so we handle multiple different just assessments in terms of those that are required for licensure. So there's that, and we cannot get around that. And our program is also set up just to be able to support that. But then other assignments, I just mentioned a few of those, but it really just depends on the course. But every review that we go through, it comes down to the rigor and the relevance. Like, how is this relevant? And is this something that a real practicing, highly skilled teacher should be able to do and will ever do? And that's another thing that really is important to us. And whenever we're going through and we're reviewing material each semester, it helps us to strike things out. Like, I remember in my master's programs, maybe the capstone was creating a SPED brochure. Like, I've never had to create a brochure in a disability in my life. And that was a capstone of a course. And I went to a pretty decent, state college, right? The difference is the culminating capstone for our program is actually a capstone action research course, where they're taking everything they've learned, they're researching, like actual research, and they're learning how to implement changes of their own, and we're sort of guiding that process. And that was really born of work that I've done in K-12 with teachers, because whenever teachers have agency over their work, they don't feel the symptoms of like burnout or moral injury in the same way. If you're like, no, I can actually solve this problem. I actually don't need to wait for someone to come and solve it for me. But that's a really tall order whenever you've never been trained to do that, or you've never been validated that your work actually is action research. So that's just an example, and that, just the capstone of our program alone, I think really stands out in terms of both rigor and relevance, and that most candidates don't see anything like close to action research until a master's level program. And that's actually where our candidates in their program with us in undergrad.
Thank you. Let's talk about mentor teachers. What is the mentor teacher's involvement for your teacher apprentices?
This is an area that we are definitely still figuring out, and I think it's a wonderful place for collaboration of spaces that have like just done really great things with mentoring. So the clinical year is a little more cut and dry. So mainly our candidates are in Arkansas and Louisiana in terms of our clinical program. They spread further out there with our other programs, but a huge part of that is actually mandated by the state. Louisiana has pretty stringent requirements for mentors, like lots of training and endorsements and certifications that come before they ever get to us. So once they're with us, it's just a lot of support, and some more than others, because we also realize that we're pretty much only in really rural areas or really urban areas that there's teacher turnover. So it's not uncommon. We had a mentor this year that it was only her second year in the classroom, but there was nobody else. And that's another reality that we have to deal with. And I know that that is like any ed prep provider is no stranger to that. Like, sometimes there's just no one and you have to take who you take. So for us, sometimes the support is really intensive in working with the mentor to get their skills up. And also helping them understand that, maybe you have been teaching for a really long time and we're going to show things, but it's not to threaten or to undermine what you're doing in your classroom. So some we are a lot more one-on-one with. And then what we're developing right now are just more times for the mentors to come together. It's also pretty different mentoring. I'll be more colloquial, like a whippersnapper, that just is graduating, they're fresh and new in the world, and somebody who's, 43 years old and has been doing this a minute. That takes a bit of a different skill set as well. And so that's the area that we're trying to put our eggs in the basket to try to figure out, because the coaching isn't necessarily the same. And just like with all things, relationships matter so much and trust matters so much. So yes, that's an area that we have not like figured it all completely out, because we're, encountering these new things that we didn't account for. And some of those are the ones that I just mentioned. So it's a fun time and totally open for any collaboration with anything, but especially that area.
Great. And then my last question is, how is the role of the faculty instructor similar and different to online learning without apprenticeship?
Sure. And this I could say because, like I said, I was an instructor for a few different universities prior. And I know every university is very, very different. and I can only, I'm only one person and one person's story. So definitely take it with several grains of salt if you like things saltier. I don't know. But um, my role in my experience, I was on as an adjunct, which is predominantly what we have with Reach, but we call them professors of practice because they're people who actually choose to work all day, like in their teaching job or as superintendents or principals. And then they share their expertise with us in the evenings with our candidates. So what was the most different, and it's funny, I was working at the Department of Ed in Louisiana whenever I came on to Reach, and I was like, I'm not dean material. Like, I don't know how to dean. I don't do that. um and it's interesting, I'm a few more years in now, and now I see there was space for me all along, right? But I say that because my prior experiences as an adjunct, it was very much like, here's some stuff, and just like, just see you and put your grades in and peace, which is fine. It's totally fine. I'm a teacher. I can figure anything out. So that wasn't going to work with this because it was all too new. So a lot of our recruiting started to inform a lot of what we needed. For our particular candidates in our setting, we needed folks who had chops in the classroom. And a lot of that is because the weight of the fact that a lot of the spaces that where we operate, these really rural spaces, really urban spaces, we might be their only shot at having any type of like current teaching practice, like any access to higher ed, period. And we wanted that by design, but there was a responsibility that comes with that. And so we needed to have folks who were pretty current in practice in their field. And so that's why we started to invest a lot in the professor of practice model. We also have a lot of folks who, again, our median age is 36, 37. And a lot of times with adult learners, teachers can be very beautifully cynical. And so if it's not someone who can walk the walk or who knows, like, no, this is the thing, it just makes a world of difference whenever a person speaking to certain candidates with experience of like, well, I did this morning, and so this really worked. Or, wow, you're absolutely right. I understand that population you're teaching. Let's adapt it. Let's try this instead. Or let's try it and look at some data and see how we might change it. But in any way, our context, it was really important for us to have folks who had current practice. Now, the other piece of that is how it all comes together, because we have a pretty vibrant faculty with all different sorts of expertise and all different layers and levels of experience in the field in terms of practice of pre-K 12. So I ran it the only way that I knew how, and I find that this has been incredibly helpful. It looks and feels like a PLC at a school, which is where it all comes back, and it's at multiple levels. So we actually do come together, like faculty leads that come together. We look what's working, what's not, what's happening and what's not. A major hurricane here. Oh, an earthquake there. Oh, a tornado and this destroyed. So we're always super current on, like, we have a pulse on the lives of our candidates. A lot of us are in the same areas, so we know if there hasn't been power, and these are very real things, right? Like in the South, there hasn't been power in 2 weeks. Like, we're still making it work, but that really helps. Just having people with like a footprint across the areas that we work. And then that we're always talking about what we can do better, because again, we have high expectations, but the highest ones are for ourselves. And so whenever whenever we're looking at praxis data and it's not where we want it to be, we need to make some changes and adjustments, because we can have all the data in the world. We'll just be highly informed inactors if we don't actually look at it and use it. And so that, I think, is the biggest piece, is that even our adjuncts or professors of practice who are the furthest removed from the daily work are still very much included in their own, we'll call them verticals, or their own verticals or their own horizontals, because they still are working every single month, twice a month, with what is happening with this content right now. It also helps us to keep a pulse and just sort of calling a spade in highly charged political years like this one's going to be. We might need to take a look at certain assignments that are triggering in ways we didn't intend for them to be, or preparing to be able to assuage some of the outcome of that if we need to. But also, how can we turn things into teaching moments where the teacher understands that that's not what you need to represent in your classroom. You're going to focus on this. You're learning this because of this. What happens when you do this? So the only way for us to be able to have such an all-encompassing sort of a community of learning and a community of practice is to have ways that faculty actually come together and talk about them. And we also know that none of us are smarter than the class brain. So the floor is always open for for any of our incredible faculty members to share, to be able to talk about things that have worked, talk about things in your setting, because again, we have all this experience, like folks who have, managed school systems or whatever. Please, if you're seeing that, come and tell us. Don't hold the good stuff for yourself. So I think that in all the ways we are always learning. And so that's something that is a huge difference. And again, that's from me as someone who started as an adjunct in different spaces. And as long as my grades were in, I don't think they knew I was alive. And then there's spaces here where everybody's just so involved. Even professors who may only have one section of one class that meets once a week, the involvement is still very much there, and it's critical for our candidate success.
That's great. Thank you.